He walked into that forest 7 decades ago. He has not missed a single dinner since. The morning after the full moon, the kitchen always smelled like the forest. Not pine, not rain, something older than both. The specific cold smell of old-growth trees that have been at the same temperature for longer than the village has existed. The smell of something vast and still that had no business being in a kitchen, in a house at the edge of a valley where a 94-year-old woman was supposed to be dying quietly and without incident. Eska Thorne was not dying quietly. She was waiting. Every full moon, she set a place at the kitchen table. Same plate, same cup, same chair pulled out at the precise angle of someone expected. Not hoped for, expected. The way you expect sunrise. The way you expect the tide. The absolute certainty of a woman who had been doing this for 7 decades and had never once been wrong about what was coming through her door when the moon was full and the forest at the northern edge of Velthar Valley went completely still. Her husband walked into that forest 7 decades ago. He has not missed a single dinner since. Neve Arden was 31 years old when the palliative care agency sent her to Velthar Valley. She had sat with 47 dying people across 7 years of this work. She knew what the end looked like. She knew its sounds, its silences, and the specific quality of a room where life was finishing itself. She arrived with a medical bag, a notebook, and 7 years of careful professional distance from everything she observed. The first morning she walked into the kitchen and smelled the forest, she stopped moving. The chair at the table was still warm. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and looked at the empty chair and the cleared table and the specific quality of stillness in that kitchen. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of a room that had just been occupied by something that had left in its own time and on its own terms. She understood, in the way you understand things that arrive below the level of professional reasoning, that she had not been sent to this valley to help anyone die. She had been sent to witness something that had been happening here for 7 decades and had been waiting for exactly the right witness. Neve Arden did not leave. On the last night, she set the table herself. If this is your first time here, welcome to Scar Howl Audiobooks. Hit subscribe and then leave it a like so you never miss what the forest keeps. Now stay with this. It gets darker. The road into Velthar Valley ran north. Neve had not registered this on the map when she accepted the assignment. She registered it on the drive, the specific quality of a road that only ran one direction, the landscape on either side narrowing as the valley compressed around the single route in, the ridgelines rising on both sides until the sky above the road was a strip of gray-white light between 2 walls of rock and tree, and the accumulated silence of a place that had been exactly this way for a very long time and had no intention of changing. The valley received her the way it received everyone's, without drama, without announcement, simply present when she next paid attention. One moment she was on the open road. The next she was inside the valley, the ridgelines close on either side, the forest beginning at the northern edge of her vision, the village of Velthar arranged along the road's final kilometer with a specific spacing of a settlement that had once held more people and had not adjusted to holding fewer. She pulled up outside the house at the end of the afternoon. It was the last house on the road before the road ended. Beyond it, the valley's northern field, widad, flat, the grass uniform in the way of ground that had stopped growing and simply held its height, permanent and unchanging in the specific way of things that had been at the same condition for longer than seasonal variation could affect them. Beyond the field, the forest, dense, the canopy beginning immediately at the field's edge, the tree line a clean, hard boundary between the valley's limited light and the permanent near dark below the old-growth canopy. Neve sat in the car for a moment before getting out. She was not a woman who sat in cars before getting out. She was a woman who moved efficiently from one task to the next, who had learned across 7 years of this work that hesitation in a doorway communicated uncertainty to patients who needed to feel that the person caring for them was not uncertain. She got out of cars. She was slight in the way of someone who had spent years moving efficiently through other people's spaces. The particular leanness of a person who had learned not to take up more room than the situation required. Her skin was warm brown, her close-cropped, natural hair still carrying the cold of the drive. She wore her work clothes, dark trousers, a gray-fitted jacket over a plain shirt, the small worn notebook already visible in the jacket's outer pocket where she kept it for immediate access. Her eyes were the quality that patients remembered afterwards. Steady, dark, the eyes of someone who had learned to be present with difficult things without flinching from them. She looked at the house. She looked at the forest behind it. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. Eska Thorne was at the door before Neve reached it. 94 years old, and the first thing Neve registered was not fragility. Not the diminishment she had learned to expect in patients this age. The shrinking, the careful economy of movement, the body conserving what little it had left. Eska Thorne stood in her doorway with the specific stillness of someone who had long since stopped needing movement to communicate presence. Her body was slight, yes, the bones visible at the wrists, the skin thinned with age to a translucency that showed the architecture beneath. But the eyes, dark, direct, unhurried, were the eyes of someone whose mind had outlasted her body by a considerable margin and was not particularly troubled by this discrepancy. She looked at Neve with the expression of someone who had been expecting a specific person and was relieved to confirm the right one had arrived. She said, "You will want tea after that drive. Come in." She turned and walked back into the house without waiting to see if Neve would follow. Neve followed. The house was the house of someone who had been in one place for a very long time, not cluttered, nothing accumulated for its own sake, no surface covered in the way of people who could not let go of things. But everything present had been in its position for long enough that moving it would have constituted a kind of damage. The shelf beside the kitchen window with its three specific objects, a smooth gray stone, a folded piece of cloth, a small jar with something dark inside that Neve did not examine closely on the first day. The chair by the window that faced the field and the forest beyond it, worn at the armrests in the specific pattern of someone who had spent decades in that exact position. The kitchen table, 4 chairs, 2 of them pushed in at angles that suggested they had not been moved in years. One of them Eska's, one of them across from Eska's at the precise position of someone expected. Neve set her bag down. She sat at the table. She accepted the tea. She opened her notebook. The intake process was familiar. The questions she had asked 47 times across 7 years, the categories she had learned to move through efficiently, the specific balance of clinical thoroughness and human presence that good palliative care required. Medical history, current medications, pain levels and patterns, mobility, appetite, sleep, the things the body was doing and the things it had stopped doing and the things it would stop doing soon. Eska answered precisely. Not briefly, she was not a woman who gave brief answers when precise ones were available, but exactly. She gave what was asked and held everything else at a deliberate distance, the way you hold a door open exactly as far as the situation requires and no further. Then Neve asked about next of kin. Eska set her cup down. She looked at Neve with the direct, unhurried gaze that Neve was already learning to read, as the expression she used when she was deciding exactly how much of an answer to give. She said, "I will write you a list." She wrote it slowly in the handwriting of someone for whom the act of writing was still deliberate and considered. 8 names, each one with a brief notation beside it. Neve looked at the list. She looked at Eska. She said she would follow up with the contacts. Eska said, "Do that." She picked up her cup again. The conversation moved on. They talked about the house, what Neve would need, where things were, the rhythms of the day. Eska had been running for decades and saw no reason to alter significantly because a nurse had arrived. At the end of the afternoon, Eska mentioned, without emphasis, without particular weight, that she would need the kitchen to herself on the evening of the next full moon. A week and a half away, she would appreciate it if Neve could make herself comfortable elsewhere in the house for that evening. Neve said, "Of course," she said it without hesitation. She would think about that later. Why the agreement had come so easily. Why she had not asked the question any reasonable professional should have asked. Why the specific quality of Eska's request had made the question feel unnecessary. The Valley, she would eventually understand, had a way of making certain agreements feel natural before you had been given any reason to find them natural. That evening, on the evening after Eska had gone to bed, Neve sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and looked up the names on the list. She looked up all 8. She cross-referenced. She searched the available records, the accessible databases, the public documentation, the digital trail that people left when they existed in the world in the ordinary way of people who had addresses and employment, and the small continuous administrative footprint of a life being lived. None of the 8 names had a footprint, not a current one. The trail in each case ran for a time, some longer than others, some cutting off more recently than others, and then simply ended. Not death records, not relocation, just the specific administrative silence of someone who had stopped existing in any system that tracks such things. She looked at the list for a long time. 8 names, 8 people Eska Thorne had listed as her closest living contacts. 8 trails that ended in the same administrative silence. The same specific absence of a person who had stopped being findable in any record that mattered. What did that mean for a woman who had spent her entire life in this valley? What did it mean that the people she considered her nearest were people the world had stopped being able to account for? Neve did not write these questions in her notebook. She had learned across 7 years of this work that some questions were better carried than documented, that writing a thing down too early gave it a fixity it had not yet earned, a certainty that the situation had not yet confirmed. She held the questions. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She lay in the spare room with the window showing her the field and the forest beyond it, and the specific quality of darkness that settled over Velthar Valley at night. Not the darkness of the absence of light, but the darkness of a place that had its own relationship with the dark. Comfortable in it, at home in it, the way you are at home in a room you have occupied for long enough that you no longer need to see it to know exactly where everything is. She lay there for a long time before she slept. The forest was completely still. She would think about that later too, the specific quality of the forest's stillness. Not the stillness of emptiness, not the stillness of a place where nothing was present, the stillness of a place where something was present and had decided for the moment to be still. There was a difference. Neve had spent enough time in rooms with dying people to know the difference between a room that was empty and a room that was occupied and quiet. The forest at the northern edge of Velthar Valley was occupied and quiet. Whatever occupied it was patient. Whatever occupied it had been patient for a very long time and had no reason to stop. The village of Velthar occupied the valley's middle section. The houses spaced along both sides of the single road with the interval of a community that had arranged itself across generations, rather than in a single-plan moment. Old houses, well-maintained in the way of structures that had been cared for continuously, rather than repaired periodically. The maintenance so consistent that the houses had simply never deteriorated. Their condition not the result of recent attention, but of the patient accumulated attention of people who had been here long enough to understand that the valley required this of them. Neve walked the village in the mornings before Eska needed her. She was not asking questions directly. She had learned across 7 years of entering other people's lives at their most vulnerable point that direct questions produced managed answers. She walked. She was present. She let the village register her presence and decide at its own pace what it wanted to offer. What the village offered about Eska Thorne was consistent and specific and arrived each time with the same quality. Not reluctance, not the careful hedging of people protecting something sensitive, but the matter-of-fact register of people describing something so long accepted that it had stopped requiring the particular care you applied to difficult things. Eska had been here her whole life. Her family had been here for generations before her. She knew the valley the way the valley knew itself, completely without needing to look directly at it. The knowledge having moved long ago from the level of awareness into something closer to bone. The table was mentioned without being discussed. A woman at the northern end of the village, tending a kitchen garden with the economical movements of someone for whom gardening had long since stopped being a task and become simply a condition of existing in this place each morning, said, "Eska has her routines, always has. The valley respects that. We all do." She turned back to her garden. The conversation closed the way All conversations in Velthar closed, not with conclusion, but with a door quietly pulled shut. Neve stood at the garden's edge for a moment after the woman turned away. She looked at the beds, the careful rows, the specific arrangement of plants that had been in the same positions for as long as the garden had existed. She looked at the woman's hands moving through the soil with the automatic ease of someone who had been doing this so long, the movement had stopped requiring thought. She thought about Eska at the kitchen table. The same chair, the same cup, the same precise arrangement across 7 decades. She thought about what it meant to do the same thing in the same place for long enough that the doing became something the hands knew how to perform without instruction from the mind. She thought about what it meant to do the same thing for someone who kept coming back. She walked on. The general store at the village's center was run by a man named Callet Moss. Quiet, unhurried, the economical manner of someone who had been in the same space for long enough that he and the space had reached a mutual understanding and no longer required anything of each other beyond simple coexistence. He had known Eska Thorne his entire life. His father had known her. His grandfather had known her. He said this without particular emphasis, as though the longevity of the acquaintance was simply a fact of geography. If you had been in Velthar Valley long enough, you knew Eska Thorne, the same way you knew the forest at the northern edge and the field between them and the specific quality of the valley's light that made distances soft and edges uncertain. Neve asked if anyone ever left the valley. Callet looked at her with the careful eyes of someone deciding how much of an answer the question deserved. He said, "Some do. Early on, mostly, the ones who came from somewhere else and find after a season or two that somewhere else is still calling." He straightened a stack of tins on the shelf beside him, a small automatic gesture, the hands doing what they knew how to do while the mind considered. "The ones who were born here," he said, "mostly stay." He paused. "The valley makes it easy to stay." He said it without weight, without implication, as simple fact. It is a comfortable place. It looks after what it has. Neve said, "And the ones who go into the forest." The stillness that arrived in the store then was not the stillness of discomfort. It was the stillness of a subject being given its appropriate weight, the specific quality of a pause that contained a great deal and was not going to release most of it. Callet looked at the shelf. He said, "The forest looks after those two, in its own way." He picked up his cloth and began wiping the counter. "That is all I would say about it," he said. "That is what anyone here would say about it. Not because there is nothing more to say, because the more is not ours to say." The conversation closed. Neve bought what she had come for and walked back up the road toward the house and held what Callet Moss had given her the same way she had been holding everything the village offered, carefully without pressing it into a shape it had not yet taken on its own. An elderly man named Paris Olin, who was the oldest resident after Eska and had lived in the valley his entire life, sat on his porch each morning in the same chair at the same hour, with the same cup of something dark, and accepted Neve's company without comment. He was the one who told her about Aldrich Thorne. He did not use a date. He said, many decades back, during a particularly hard winter, when the snow came early and stayed past its welcome, Eska's husband went into the northern forest. He said it the way you say something you have been saying your entire life, the words worn smooth with repetition. The shape of the story settled into its final form long ago. He went in during a bad storm, Paris said, the kind of storm the valley gets sometimes, when the weather comes down off the ridges and settles in and decides to stay for a while. He went in and he did not come back the way he left. Neve asked what that meant. Parasol looked at her with the patient eyes of someone who had been waiting for that question and had a prepared answer that was not prepared to explain everything. He said he came back, just not the way he left. He picked up his cup. He looked at the forest at the northern edge of the village, visible above the roof lines, the canopy dark and dense even in the morning's limited light. The valley keeps things, he said, has always kept things. What it keeps completely. He looked back at his cup. Eska understood that. She has always understood that. That is why she sets the table. Neve stood with that for a moment. She said, does anyone else set a table? Paris was quiet long enough that a bird somewhere above the roofline went through a full call and fell silent. Then he said, "Not everyone who goes into the forest comes back at all. The ones who come back, they come back to whoever was worth coming back for." He paused. Aldrich Thorne had a very good reason to come back. He has never needed reminding of it. He looked at Neve. Eska has never needed to set two places. Just the one, just to show him the light is still on. Neve said, "What changed him?" Paris looked at her. It was not a look of surprise. The question did not appear to surprise him, which itself told her something. It was the look of someone who had been asked a question they had been waiting for and had decided across the years of waiting exactly how to answer it. He said, "The forest does not change people." He paused. "It reveals them." What Aldrich Thorne became in that forest, that was always in him. The forest simply gave it room. He looked back at the tree line above the rooftops. "The valley knows what a person is," he said. "It has always known. It is very patient about waiting for them to know it too." Nav went back to the house. Eska was in her chair by the window, facing the field and the forest beyond it. The afternoon light, the compressed, slightly wrong quality light of the valley that made distances soft and edges uncertain, came through the glass at the angle it always came through at this hour, and sat across Eska's face and hands with the familiar quality of something that had been doing this for decades and knew the route. Neve sat across from her. They did not always talk. That was one of the things Neve had come to value across 7 years of this work. The specific companionable silence that developed between a good nurse and a patient who trusted her. The silence of people who had stopped needing to fill space with performance. She sat with Eska, and the afternoon moved through the window, and the forest at the field's edge held its position, and Eska looked at it with the settled, patient expression of someone watching for something they were completely certain was coming. After a while, Neve said, "Paris told me about your husband." Eska did not look away from the window. She said, "Paris has been telling that story his whole life. His mother told it to him. Her mother told it to her." She paused. "They tell it correctly as far as it goes." She paused again. "It does not go very far in the telling." Neve said, "What does it leave out?" Eska looked at her then, the dark, direct eyes, unhurried, making a decision. "Then it leaves out what he smells like when he comes in. The cold of the forest on him, and underneath it, something warmer. The specific warmth of someone you have known long enough that their warmth is familiar to you at a level below conscious recognition. It leaves out the way he holds his cup." She looked back at the window. "The telling of a thing and the thing itself are very different," she said. "The village tells it. I live it. There is no comparison between those two experiences." She said nothing else. The afternoon light moved across her hands. Outside, the forest was dark and still and permanent and full, and Nave sat across from a woman who had been maintaining a marriage with something the valley had translated her husband into for 7 decades and found, for the first time in 7 years of sitting with people at the end of their lives, that she did not have a category for what she was witnessing. She opened her notebook that evening. She wrote, "Eska Thorne is not dying the way people die. She is completing something. There is a difference. I am not yet certain I understand the difference. I am writing this down so I will know I noticed it." She looked at what she had written. Then she added, "The next full moon is in 4 days. The valley changed on the day of the full moon, not dramatically, not in any way Neve could have pointed to in a clinical note and defended as observable fact. But the change was present, a quality in the air that was different from the preceding days, lower and denser, as though the atmosphere above the valley had settled closer to the ground, compressing the space between things, making the field seem nearer to the house and the forest seem nearer to the field. The light was different too, the same compressed quality that characterized all of Velthar Valley's light, but intensified as though the valley was paying closer attention to itself on this particular day. Eska was different, not dramatically, not in a way the medical notes would capture, but present in a way that was more than her usual presence, alert in the specific way of someone whose body has registered something it has been waiting for, whose attention has been claimed by something approaching that is not yet here but is close enough to feel. She moved through the morning with a deliberateness that was more than her usual deliberateness. She ate her breakfast with an appetite she had not had in several days. She sat in her chair by the window and looked at the forest with an expression that was not her usual settled patience, but something more active, the specific quality of attention you give to something you can already, just barely, perceive. In the late afternoon, as she asked Neve to help her to the kitchen, Neve helped her. Eska moved to the table. She stood at it for a moment, her hands on the back of her own chair, looking at the place across from her. Then she looked at Neve and said, "I will need the kitchen now. I would appreciate it if you made yourself comfortable in the hall." Neve said, "Of course." She went to the hall. She sat in the chair at the hall's end, the wooden chair beside the small table where Eska kept a lamp and a folded cloth and nothing else. She left the kitchen door open. She did not look through it. She looked at the wall in front of her and listened. The sounds of preparation reached her from the kitchen. Water running, the specific weight of a plate being placed on a wooden table, not set down carelessly, placed with the deliberate care of someone who knew exactly how the person they were setting it for preferred to find it. The cup, the specific sound of a cup placed on a table by someone who had been placing it in the same position for 7 decades, the movement so automatic it had stopped being the movement and become simply a condition of the hands, something they did without needing instruction. Then the chair, the specific sound of a chair being pulled out at a precise angle, not Eska's chair, the other one, the one that sat across from Eska's in the position of someone expected. Then quiet, not empty quiet. Neve had sat with enough dying people to know the difference between a room that was empty and a room that was occupied. The quiet that came from the kitchen was the quiet of a room that had just received something. The specific quality of air that had been empty and was empty no longer. The atmospheric shift of a space accommodating a presence it had been prepared for. Neve sat completely still. Her notebook was in her hands. She did not open it. She held it the way you hold something familiar when everything around you has moved outside the familiar, the specific comfort of a known object in an unknown situation. From the kitchen, the sounds of a meal being shared. She would not be able to describe them adequately in her notebook later, and she would try and cross it out and try again, and eventually write only 2 people at a table. That was what it sounded like. The cup placed and lifted, in the rhythm of someone who had been drinking from it long enough that the movement was automatic. The specific sound of a chair shifting slightly and not restlessly, the small, comfortable adjustment of someone who was exactly where they wanted to be and was settling further into it. Long silences that were not uncomfortable. The specific quality of silence between 2 people who had been in each other's company long enough that silence required no management, no filling, no apology. Once, in the long stretch of the evening, a sound that was not quite voice and not quite anything else. Low, present. The sound of something communicating in a register that was not language but carried the specific weight of language. Meaning without words, the way certain sounds carry meaning below the threshold of conscious interpretation. Neve felt it in her chest before she heard it with her ears. She did not go to the kitchen door. She sat in the hall with her notebook in her hands and let the kitchen be what the kitchen needed to be, and breathed carefully and evenly in the way she had learned to breathe in rooms where things were happening that were larger than her professional framework and required, above all, that she remain present without imposing. The sounds of departure came later. She did not know how much later. The hall's quality of time had shifted, the way time shifted in Velthar Valley, cycling rather than progressing. The hour uncertain. The chair. The specific sound of someone rising from a table. Not Eska, the other chair, the expected one. Then a sound she spent a long time afterwards trying to locate in the house's floor plan. Not the front door, not any door she could account for. A sound that was not quite a door and not quite anything else. The sound of something that had arrived through a boundary that was not a door and was leaving through it again in its own time and on its own terms. Then silence. Genuine empty silence. The room giving back its emptiness. She sat in the hall until the silence had been present long enough to be certain of it. Then she got up. She went to the kitchen doorway. She stood in it. The table was cleared. Everything put away with the specific care of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. Not tidied, restored, the kitchen returned to exactly the state it had been in before the evening began, with one difference. One difference Neve stood looking at for a long time. The chair, the expected one, the one that had been pulled out at the precise angle of someone expected, had been pushed back in. Not pushed in the way you push a chair in when you are finished with a meal and leaving a room carelessly. Pushed in with a specific deliberate care. The kind of care you use when you are leaving a room you intend to return to and you want it to be right when you come back. Eska was at the stove, her back to Neve, moving with a steadiness of hand and sureness of step that she had not had the previous evening. Not recovered. Neve was too experienced to mistake what she was seeing for recovery. The body's condition had not changed in the ways that mattered. The underlying work of the decline was continuing. But something had been restored to her that the days between full moons took away. Something that the body required and had been receiving on this schedule for 7 decades, and that nothing else in the world could provide. She said, without turning around, "He sends his regards." She said nothing else. She plated the breakfast and set it on the table and sat down and ate, and Neve sat across from her and ate, and the kitchen was warm and the forest smell, the specific old growth cold of it, the smell of something vast and still, faded slowly as the morning came in through the window, present and then less present and then gone. The way something goes when it has delivered what it came to deliver and has no further reason to linger. Neve opened her notebook when she was alone. She wrote, "He came. I did not see him. I heard him. I felt the room change when he arrived and change again when he left. I do not have a clinical category for what I am documenting. I am documenting it anyway. The record should reflect what happened. The record should not decide what it means." She looked at what she had written. Then she added, "The chair was pushed in with such care. That is the detail I keep returning to. 7 decades of full moons, and he still pushes the chair in with care. Whatever the valley made of him, it kept that." Several weeks passed. The decline was visible now in the specific ways that decline became visible to someone who had been trained to read it. The slight tremor in Eska's hands in the mornings, the longer rest she needed between movements, the way she measured her energy across the day with the careful precision of someone working with a diminishing resource and unwilling to waste any of it on things that did not matter. She slept more. She ate less. The chair by the window was where she spent most of her hours, looking at the field and the forest beyond it, with an expression that had shifted slightly from the settled patience of the preceding weeks into something more concentrated. The specific quality of attention you bring to something you know is approaching its conclusion and want to be fully present for. She spoke more, not about the table, not about the full moon or what it brought to her kitchen or the 7 decades of the same chair pulled out at the same angle for the same presence. She spoke about the valley, its history, its qualities, the specific logic of a place that had been here long enough to develop its own internal rules and its own relationship with the things that lived inside it. She spoke about the forest, not with fear, not with the careful distance that outsiders brought to it, but with the matter-of-fact intimacy of someone who had grown up in its shadow and understood it the way you understood a neighbor you had lived beside your entire life. You did not need to go inside their house to know them. You knew them from the quality of the light in their windows and the sounds that came through the shared wall, in the specific way they moved through the space between your two properties. She spoke once about the early years. They were sitting in the kitchen in the late afternoon, the wrong quality valley light coming through the window. And Eska said, the first years after he changed were the hardest. Not because of what he had become, because of what people assumed I must be feeling about what he had become. She paused. They assumed grief. She paused again. I was not grieving, I was adjusting. There is a very significant difference between those two things, and most people do not understand it because most people have never had to adjust to something this specific. Neve said, "What were you adjusting to?" Eska looked at her hands on the table. She said the smell of the forest on him, the way the cold came in with him and stayed in the room for a time after he left. The sounds he made that were not the sounds he used to make, but carried the same meaning as the sounds he used to make if you listened correctly. She paused. You have to learn to listen correctly. He had to learn to communicate correctly. We both had to learn. She looked up. A marriage is always that, she said. Two people learning each other's language. Ours just required more adjustment than most. She said nothing else on the subject that afternoon. Nive sat with what Eska had given her. Not just the information, the quality of the giving. The specific register of a woman who had been carrying this for 7 decades and had decided, somewhere in the accumulation of afternoons with Niamh beside her in the kitchen light, that Niamh had earned the weight of it. Not the full weight. Eska was precise about what she released and what she kept. But enough, the smell of the forest on him, the way he held his cup, the specific language of a relationship that had required both people to learn a new vocabulary for the same love. Niamh thought about what that meant. Not the strangeness of it, which was considerable, but the core of it, which was not strange at all. Two people, decades, the continuous patient work of understanding someone who had changed and choosing to keep understanding them. Was that not what every long marriage was? Was the specific form of the change the thing that mattered? Or was it the choice, made daily, made across seasons, made across 7 decades of full moons, to keep setting the table? She did not write these questions in her notebook. They were not the kind of questions that benefited from being written down. They were the kind that needed to be carried, turned over slowly, allowed to settle into their own answers in their own time. The valley, she was beginning to understand, operated on this principle. It did not rush its revelations. It gave you what you were ready for when you were ready for it and trusted you to do the necessary work of understanding on your own schedule. She was learning to trust the valley back. The next full moon was approaching. Niamh had been tracking it, not anxiously, not with the quality of someone bracing for something, but with the attention of someone who had understood that the full moon was the organizing principle of this house, in this life, in this particular relationship between a woman and a valley, in the thing the valley had made of the person she had loved. She tracked it the way you track a tide, practically, and information, because the tide affected everything, and it was useful to know it when it was coming. 3 days before the moon was full, Niamh came to the kitchen doorway in the late afternoon and found Eska at the table. She was attempting to set the place. The plate was in her hands. Her hands were trembling. Not dramatically, the small persistent tremor that had arrived in the preceding weeks and established itself as a permanent condition of the decline. And she was standing at the table with the plate in the specific focused concentration of someone applying everything they had to a task that had previously required nothing. Her face was set, her jaw tight. She was not going to ask for help. She had been setting this table for 7 decades without help, and the body's current limitations were an inconvenience she intended to work around. Niamh crossed the kitchen. She took the plate from Eska's hands. She did it without comment, without the particular careful delicacy that people sometimes brought to taking things from patients who were struggling, the delicacy that communicated pity, which was the one thing good palliative care never communicated. She took the plate the way you take something from someone whose hands are full when yours are empty. Practically, without ceremony. She set the plate on the table. She looked at it. She looked at the table. She moved the plate slightly. She did not know why. Some knowledge in her hands that had arrived without her permission. The specific position that felt correct in a way she could not account for. The cup. She found it on the shelf and placed it. The chair. She pulled it out at the angle she had seen it pulled out from the hall doorway, the specific angle of someone expected. She stepped back. Eska was watching her. Her expression was not surprise, not gratitude, or not only gratitude, something underneath the gratitude that was more complex and less nameable. The specific expression of someone seeing a thing done correctly by someone they had not expected to know how to do it correctly. She said, "You knew where the cup went." Niamh said, "Yes." Eska said nothing for a moment. Then she sat down in her own chair. Niamh helped her, steadying her arm, and she looked at the place setting across from her with the expression, Neve had come to know well across the preceding weeks. The absolute certainty of someone looking at a thing they knew was coming. The patience of it. The warmth underneath the patience. Not the warmth of hope. The warmth of knowledge. The specific settled warmth of someone whose faith had been confirmed enough times that it had stopped needing to be called faith and had become simply fact. She said, "He always knew when I needed him most." She paused. The valley taught him that. He was always a good student. She said nothing else. Neve left the kitchen when the time came. She sat in the hall in the wooden chair. The sounds from the kitchen were the same as before. The cup, the chair, the rhythm of two people at a table who had been at this table together long enough that the rhythm was automatic. But the forest smell that came under the kitchen door was stronger than it had been the first time. The specific old-growth cold of it more present, filling the hall in a way it had not filled it before, as though whatever came to the table had come closer to the door this time, had been aware of what the preceding days had cost the woman at the table and had adjusted its proximity accordingly. In the morning, Eska ate everything on her plate. She looked out the window at the forest with the settled expression of someone whose faith has just been confirmed and expects it will be confirmed again. She did not discuss the previous evening. She did not need to. The evidence of it was in the steadiness of her hands at breakfast and the quality of her presence across the rest of the day, restored in the specific way that the full moon restored her, not to health but to completeness. The sense of a person who had received something they required and was, for the interval between this moon and the next, whole. Neve wrote in her notebook, "She is not dying between the full moons. She is waiting for them. The dying and the waiting are happening simultaneously, and they are not the same in a process. I have never seen this before. I do not expect to see it again." She paused. Then she added, "I knew where the cup went. I do not know how I knew." The valley, I think, is patient about this kind of thing. It teaches you what you need to know when you need to know it and does not trouble you with explanations. Eska was dying. Neve knew the signs. She had sat with enough dying to read the specific language of a body completing its work, the particular rhythm of breath that changed in the final days, the way the skin changed, the specific quality of presence that shifted as the body's resources concentrated on the single remaining task. She had read these signs in 47 people across 7 years, and she read them now in Eska Thorne with the same clinical accuracy and felt, alongside the clinical accuracy, something she had not felt in 7 years of this work. She did not want Eska to go. She had sat with people she cared for. She had learned across 7 years to care for them without becoming attached in the way that made their dying harder to witness. She maintained the specific professional warmth that was genuine but boundaried, present but not consuming. She had been good at this. She had considered it one of the skills she had developed that she was most certain of. Eska Thorne had not been interested in that boundary, not aggressively. Not with the particular neediness that some patients brought to their relationship with their carers, simply with the quiet certainty of a woman who had been in this valley for 94 years and had developed a very precise sense of which things were worth maintaining and which were not, and had apparently decided sometime in the second week of Neve's presence that the boundary was not worth maintaining. She had simply continued being exactly what she was, direct, precise, occasionally unexpectedly warm, always surprising, until the boundary had become irrelevant through the accumulated weight of being ignored. 6 days before the next full moon, Eska asked her. They were sitting in the kitchen in the late morning. Eska's hands were around her cup. The tremor was more pronounced now. The cup held with a concentration of effort that it should not have required. She looked at Neve across the table with a direct, unhurried gaze that Neve had come to understand was the expression she brought to things that mattered. She said, "I need you to do something for me on the night of the moon." Neve said, "Tell me." Eska said, "Set the table the way you set it last time. You knew where everything went." She paused. "Leave the kitchen when it is time. Leave the door open. Whatever comes, let it come without witness." She paused again. "Trust the valley with what the valley has always been trusted with in this house." Neve said, "I will." Eska looked at her for a long moment. Something in the dark, direct eyes that was not gratitude and not relief and was something older than both. The specific recognition of someone seeing a person do the right thing in the right way at the right time. She said, "Good." She picked up her cup with both hands. "Good." "Good," she said again. Then she looked out the window at the field and the forest, and the afternoon moved through the glass and the valley breathed around them, and neither of them spoke again for a long time, and neither of them needed to. The days that followed were quiet. Neve sat with Eska through the afternoons. She managed the medical requirements of the decline with the efficiency of long practice. The medications, the comfort measures, the monitoring of the things that needed monitoring. She did these things with the particular care she brought to all of her work. The care that was genuine and thorough and did not mistake efficiency for coldness. But what she spent most of those final days doing was simply being present. She sat with Eska by the window and they looked at the field and the forest and talked when talking seemed right and were quiet, when quiet seemed right, and the valley moved through its cycles outside the glass, the light changing, the forest holding its permanent dark, the field maintaining its uniform height, the specific quality of Velthar Valley's atmosphere settling lower and denser as the full moon approached, in the way it always settled lower and denser as the full moon approached. Eska told her on the third to last day what she wanted done with the house. She told her with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time and had arrived at very clear conclusions. The house was to stay, not sold, not cleared, maintained. The shelf by the kitchen window, the gray stone, the folded cloth, the small jar, was not to be touched. The chair at the table was to stay in its position. The kitchen was to be kept as a kitchen. She looked at Neve and said, "Someone will come. Eventually. The valley will send someone who needs to understand what this house is." She paused. "The same way it sent you." Neve said, "I was sent to be your nurse." Eska looked at her with the expression she used when Neve said something that was technically accurate and entirely insufficient. She said, "You were sent because you were ready to understand." The nursing was the reason the agency gave. The valley had its own reasons. She looked back at the window. "It usually does," she said. "It is very patient about getting what it needs." On the last day, Eska did not rise from her bed. Neve sat with her through the morning and the afternoon, managing her comfort, monitoring her breathing, present in the specific way that good palliative care required presence, not hovering, not filling the space with unnecessary activity. Simply there, a steady, warm human presence in the room where a life was completing itself. They did not talk much. What needed to be said between them had already been said. In the weeks of mornings at the kitchen table, in the hall sitting, in the afternoon light coming through the window across Eska's hands, in the table set together in the late afternoon of the preceding full moon. The silence between them had the quality Neve had come to recognize across 7 years of this work as the silence of completion. Not emptiness, not absence, but the specific fullness of a space between two people where everything that needed to be present was present and nothing required addition. Once, in the late afternoon, Eska said, "He will come tonight, regardless. He always knows." Neve said, "I know." Eska said, "He will not need the table set to find me," but said it anyway. She paused, her eyes on the window, the forest visible at its edge. It is the gesture that matters. It has always been the gesture. She looked at Neve. He needs to know the light is still on, even tonight, especially tonight. Neve said, "I will set it." Eska looked at her for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes and the afternoon light came through the window and lay across her hands, and the valley breathed outside, and Neve sat beside her and waited. At dusk, Neve went to the kitchen. She moved through the familiar space with the ease of someone who had been in it long enough that the kitchen had stopped being someone else's kitchen and become simply a kitchen, known to her hands and her body in the specific way of spaces that have been occupied long enough to be learned. She went to the shelf, the plate, she knew which one, had known since the second full moon without being able to account for the knowing. The cup, the chair, pulled out at the precise angle of someone expected. She stood back and looked at the table. The place setting was correct. She knew it was correct the way she had known where the cup went, not from instruction, from something the valley had placed in her hands across the preceding weeks. The quiet accumulated teaching of a place that was patient about this kind of thing and gave you what you needed when you needed it. She turned off the kitchen light. She left the door open. She went to the hall and sat in the wooden chair and waited. The sounds began. The same as before, the specific quality of air in the kitchen changing. The room receiving something it had been prepared for. The atmospheric shift of a space accommodating a presence that had been coming to it for 7 decades and knew it completely. The chair, the cup placed and lifted in its familiar rhythm. The long, comfortable silences of 2 people at a table who had been at this table long enough that the silences required nothing. But underneath the sounds tonight, a different quality. The silence between the sounds was not the silence of pausing. It was the silence of listening. The specific quality of a presence at the table that was aware of what this night was, that had come knowing what this night was, that the valley had communicated to it in whatever language the valley used for things that mattered, and that had come anyway, as it had always come, because the coming was what it did and what it had always done and what 7 decades of full moons had made as fundamental to its nature as the forest itself. Neve sat in the hall. She did not write in her notebook. She held it in her hands and let the kitchen be what the kitchen needed to be and breathed carefully and was present in the way she had learned to be present. Not imposing, not filling, simply there, a witness to something that had been happening in this house for 7 decades and had been waiting. She understood now for exactly the right witness before it completed. She was still sitting in the hall when the sounds of departure came. The chair, the specific careful sound of someone leaving a table they intended to return to, and then stopping. A quality of stillness from the kitchen that was different from the stillness of an empty room. The stillness of something pausing at the threshold, aware of what was in the room at the end of the hall, aware of what this night was completing. The stillness lasted long enough for Neve to feel it fully, long enough for her to understand what was happening in that pause. The specific quality of a goodbye that was not a goodbye, a parting that carried within it the absolute certainty of return. The valley's promise kept as it had always been kept, and would go on being kept in whatever form keeping was possible after this night. Then the departure, the kitchen returning its emptiness. Neve sat in the hall for a long time after. She did not move immediately. She sat with the empty quiet of the house around her and let it be what it was, not rushed past, not filled with the next necessary action, simply received. She had learned this across 7 years of sitting with people after they left. The moment after was its own thing. It deserved its own space. It did not benefit from being hurried through. She sat in the wooden chair with her notebook in her hands and the lamp on the small table beside her burning its specific warm light across the hall floor, and she breathed carefully and let the house complete what it was completing. Then she got up and went to Eska's room. Eska was gone, peacefully in her bed, with the specific stillness of someone who had left without difficulty, who had been ready for a long time and had found the leaving easy when it came, the body releasing what it had been holding with the quiet relief of something that had been waiting for permission and had finally received it. Neve stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at Eska's face, the specific quality of stillness in it, not the stillness of sleep, which always contained the small movements of a body continuing its work, but the complete stillness of a body that had finished. She had seen this stillness 47 times. She had never seen it look like this. Not peaceful exactly. Peace was too simple a word for what Eska's face held in the lamplight. The word that came closest was completion. The specific expression of someone who had arrived at the exact endpoint they had been moving toward and had found it exactly as they expected. She had not died alone. Neve stood in the doorway and understood this fully and let the understanding settle in her without rushing it toward a conclusion. Then she went to the kitchen. The table was cleared. Everything put away with the specific care of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged, not tidied in the way of departure, but restored. The kitchen returned to its resting state, ready for the next time. The chair, the expected one, the one that had been pulled out at the precise angle of someone expected for 7 decades, had been pushed back in with such care, the kind of care you use when you are leaving a room you have been coming to for 7 decades and you want to leave it exactly right. The kind of care that was not the care of an ending, the care of someone who intended to come back and wanted the room to be right when they did. The forest smell was still present, faint, fading with the early morning the way it always faded, but present, the specific old growth cold of it, the smell of something vast and still that had no business being in a kitchen and had been in this kitchen every full moon for 7 decades and would go on being in it. Neve understood this with a certainty that did not require explanation. For however many full moons the valley still had to offer. She sat at the table, not in Eska's chair, not in the expected chair. At the side, the observer's position, the position she had occupied in this house since the first morning, the position of someone who had come to witness and had witnessed completely. She opened her notebook. She wrote Eska Thorne's name. She sat with the pen above the page for a long time. Outside the window, the valley was doing what the valley did, holding what it held, running its routes, maintaining its record of everyone who had come here and stayed long enough to be learned. The forest dark and permanent at the northern edge. The field with its uniform grass holding its height in the specific way of things that had stopped growing and simply persisted. The village beginning its morning at the valley's southern end, the lights coming on in the kitchens, one by one in the early dark, warm and consistent. The valley performing its morning the way it had performed every morning for longer than any record of it existed. She wrote, she was not alone at the end. He came. The valley kept its word, it always does. She looked at what she had written. Then she added, the chair was pushed in with such care, the same care as always. Whatever the valley made of him across 7 decades, whatever the forest translated him into, it kept that, the care for her, the specific attention of someone who has been loving the same person for a very long time and has not run out of reasons. She closed the notebook, she looked at the chair, she thought about the shelf by the window, the gray stone, the folded cloth, the small jar. She thought about Eska's instruction. The house was to stay. The shelf was not to be touched. The kitchen was to be kept as a kitchen. Someone will come, Eska had said. The valley will send someone who needs to understand what this house is. Nev looked at the chair pushed in with such care. She thought about what it meant that she knew where the cup went, that she had known since the second full moon, without being told, without being taught, without any explanation she could write in a notebook and defend as reasonable. The valley had placed that knowledge in her hands the way it placed everything's, quietly without announcement, simply present when you next paid attention. She was in no hurry to leave. The valley was patient. It had always been patient. It would go on being patient for exactly as long as it needed to be, and it had been doing this long enough to know that exactly as long as it needed to be was never very long at all. Outside, the forest held what it held. The full moon was setting. The next one was coming. It always was. If you made it this far, you already know what Scar Howl is. Hit subscribe and leave a like so the algorithm keeps bringing you back here. The forest remembers everyone who listens. It will remember you.